Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is youth, school, and marriage. Franklin Roosevelt's ancestors primarily came from the Dutch. They settled in the colony of New Amsterdam before it was even called the colony of New York. Around the time of the nation's founding, Isaac Roosevelt actually partnered with Alexander Hamilton to help found the Bank of New York, Isaac serving about 5 years as the president of that bank. There's always plenty of money, wealth in the Roosevelt family that was really split along two geographic lines in New York. You've got the Long Island side of the family, that's really the Theodore Roosevelt side, and then the Hudson River Valley, upstate New York, this is the Franklin Roosevelt side of the family, including his father, James. James went to Union College, Harvard Law School, but he never really practiced law, didn't need to. He had money in the family and brought even more money into the family when he married Rebecca Howland. She came with plenty of money. They settled in the tiny community of Hyde Park in a house that they called Springwood. James kind of living the life of a country squire, long vacations with his family. They had one child together, but then in 1876, Rebecca suffered a heart attack and she passed away. Within the next couple of years, James, looking for a new bride, he meets Sara Delano. Now, this is extreme wealth coming into the family. Sara's father made a lot of money in the shipping business. He had actually lived in China for a number of years. Well, he's 52, she's 26. They got married anyway, October the 7th of 1880, went on a honeymoon in Europe. By the time they came back, Sara was already pregnant. Their only child was born on January the 30th of 1882, and for the first couple of months, the baby was simply called Baby. There were different traditions in the family as to how to name children, and they really couldn't agree for a couple of months. Eventually, they settled on naming the baby boy after Sara's favorite uncle, Franklin Delano. That's how we get Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, FDR, the center of his parents' attention from the early going. Sara, a very hands-on mother, kind of a sheltered life for Franklin Roosevelt. Very few children around to play with. He was homeschooled, learned a lot from his dad, things like swimming and fishing and riding horses and the love of the sea. Kind of constantly had a bow and arrow for a number of years for Roosevelt did as a youth. And around the age of 11, he asked for and got a shotgun. He wanted to be able to shoot birds so that he could stuff them and study them. He was looking to pull together a collection of every species in the Hudson River area. One of the things they didn't do a lot in the Roosevelt home was talk about money. They had so much of it. Wasn't something that they really worried about, not something that they talked about. Also, not a lot of discussion about politics, although James Roosevelt was friends with the new president of the United States. The former governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, in 1885, moves to Washington, D.C., and a couple of years later, James brings his young son, Franklin, to the White House to meet the president. Interesting parting words coming from Cleveland, who was not having an easy time as president of the United States. He told Franklin, "My little man, I am making a strange wish for you. It is that you may never be president of the United States." Well, that wish would not come true. For the Roosevelts and for Franklin as a young boy, well, he traveled a lot. 8 different trips to Europe in his first 14 years. Summers they spent always at the family home at Campobello, which was an island in Canadian waters just off the coast of Maine. Again, not a lot of kids around for Franklin to play with. When they were around, it was pretty clear who took charge. Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, one time his mother, Sara, said, let the other boys make the decisions. And Franklin replied, "Mummy, if I didn't give the orders, nothing would happen." He was a leader from the very earliest days. First time Franklin Roosevelt on his own was when he was 14 years old. Boarding school. They decided to enroll him in Groton, which was one of the most exclusive boarding schools in the entire country, just north of Boston. The Reverend Endicott Peabody was leading this school, focusing on the moral, physical, and intellectual development of the charges left in his responsibility. Now, this is a big adjustment for Franklin Roosevelt. He had never been to school before, certainly never been away from home, but you wouldn't know of any concerns. His letters home, always positive and optimistic. The classroom, athletics, these were all important things at Groton, along with a sense of morality and a commitment to service. These were some of the things embedded in the psyche of Franklin Roosevelt from his headmaster, Endicott Peabody. When he becomes president of the United States, Roosevelt writes the Reverend a letter. "I count it among the blessings of my life that it was given to me in my formative years to have the privilege of your guiding hand and the benefit of your inspiring example. For all that you have been and are to me, I owe a debt of gratitude." What was Roosevelt like as a youth at Groton? Well, one of his friends was George Biddle, went on to become an artist, and Biddle described Roosevelt later as having gray-eyed, cool, self-possessed, intelligent, and had the warmest, most friendly and understanding smile. Oh, that Roosevelt smile, that would be part of his calling card throughout his political career, certainly. 20th century dawns, a decision to make as Roosevelt graduates from Groton. He kind of wanted to go to the Naval Academy. Again, that love of the sea, but all the top students from Groton went to Harvard, and that was going to be the case for Roosevelt as well, including with a number of his colleagues and friends, his closest being Lathrop Brown, who was his roommate at Groton, who would now be his roommate at Harvard. But just 3 months into his first term at Harvard in the fall of 1900, tragedy hits the Roosevelt family when James dies, leaving a pretty big gap, not only for Roosevelt, losing his father at a relatively young age, but also for his mother. Sara Roosevelt is now kind of all alone, doesn't really want to be sitting in that home in Hyde Park, so what does she do? She gets an apartment in Boston, right outside of Harvard. Now, she gave Roosevelt his space on campus, but kind of wanted to be there. He could come visit her. She would occasionally visit him on campus, give him a little bit of a respite away from other things. But again, a very tight bond between Sara and Franklin Roosevelt, really their entire life. There were some economic implications as well of the passing of James that would give an annuity essentially to Roosevelt of about $6,000 a year that he inherited. But the big money came into the family when Sara's father passed away. Warren Delano left her an estate of $1.3 million. That's about $50 million in today's money. And thanks to Sara's generosity, well, Franklin Roosevelt was never going to have to worry about money. What about Franklin Roosevelt as a student? Well, he was a decent student, according to his mother. He said he did very well at his studies, but was far from being a prodigy. In fact, Roosevelt did a lot of his best things getting to know people, joining clubs, the social life at Harvard. He was popular at the Hasty Pudding. He joined the Yacht Club, the Glee Club. His favorite was the Political Club. He was pretty disappointed that he was not invited to join Porcellian, which is the top club at the Harvard campus, but he was involved in so many other things. And his favorite activity, though, was really the group involved with the school newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. He spent 3 years working on the Crimson, several hours almost every day. In fact, he graduated early from Harvard, but enrolled in graduate school so he could spend one more year being the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Crimson. He would later say that the Harvard Crimson, well, perhaps the most useful preparation I had in college for public service was at the Harvard Crimson, in part because he wrote all the editorials of the paper, meant he had to have a pretty good pulse as to what was going on. Now, in the latter part of Roosevelt's tenure at Harvard, he meets Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin, once removed. Now, they met at a gala horse show at Madison Square Garden in New York City. They'd actually known each other since they were toddlers, but really only had seen each other on occasion. Eleanor Roosevelt was an even more sheltered youth than Franklin. Difficult period of time when her mother and one of her brothers both die when she's 8 years old, and a couple of years later her father, Elliott Roosevelt, commits suicide. Years of trouble with alcoholism. Eventually he succumbs to the bottle. And again, a very difficult youth period here for Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, just to get the family straight, Eleanor Roosevelt's father is Elliott Roosevelt. Elliott Roosevelt is Theodore Roosevelt's brother, making Theodore Roosevelt Eleanor's uncle. Also, there's a relationship between Elliott and Franklin Roosevelt. Elliott Roosevelt is the godfather of Franklin Roosevelt. So as these get together, it is kind of all in the family. Eleanor had been raised by her grandmother, very strict, again, a sheltered life. At the age of 15, she was sent off to Europe, went to England at the Allenwood School, came back in 1902, which is when she connected with Franklin Roosevelt. Now, again, they're very different. He's tall and handsome and dashing and outgoing, highly confident, and she's really much more shy and sense of inadequacy, as actually low self-esteem for Eleanor Roosevelt at this stage of her life. Nevertheless, the courtship progresses rapidly, and in his last year at Harvard, after the Harvard-Yale football game, Eleanor comes to that. They go on a walk. He pops the question, and she says yes. Sara Roosevelt, not so sure they're ready to get married. In fact, she convinces the young couple, let's keep this silent for about a year and see what happens. In fact, she takes Franklin and his friend, Lathrop Brown, on a Caribbean cruise the following summer to kind of get him away from Eleanor, see if maybe he wants to look in a different direction, but that didn't happen. Came back, and in the fall of 1904, they announced the engagement. They're going to get married on March the 17th of 1905. Why'd they pick that date? Well, it wasn't because it was St. Patrick's Day, which it was. because it happened to be the first available date for the person who was going to give away the bride. Again, Elliott Roosevelt no longer available, so Theodore is going to stand in, and he's kind of a busy guy because he had just been inaugurated as President of the United States. He had filled out William McKinley's first term, just got inaugurated for his own term. In 1905, he takes the oath of office. A couple weeks later, he's ready to hand over the bride to Franklin Roosevelt in a ceremony where, not surprisingly, the president was actually much more the center of attention than the bride or the groom. Alice Roosevelt was Theodore's daughter, and she made the point that father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He couldn't help himself be the center of attention. This was kind of a difficult transition for Eleanor Roosevelt. Again, not really ready for this whole new world of responsibility. She said, "I was completely unprepared to be a practical housekeeper, wife, or mother." She also struggled with intimacy. In fact, according to one of her children, the first kiss Eleanor Roosevelt ever had was on her wedding day when she gave her vows over with Franklin. Intimacy never coming naturally for Eleanor Roosevelt. She also struggled with the ever-presence of Sara Roosevelt. So Franklin and Eleanor go off to their honeymoon. They come back home, and there's a house fully furnished, ready for them. Sara had paid for it, and of course it was right next door to where Sara lived. A little bit later, they actually all moved to a couple of townhouses. Of course, they are connected. Again, all paid for by Sara. This was a difficult period. It kind of felt out of place in her own home for Eleanor Roosevelt. She kind of confided to her husband, who really didn't want to deal with this. In fact, Eleanor said an interesting comment about Franklin Roosevelt. If something was unpleasant, he didn't want to know about it. He just ignored it and never talked about it. I think he always thought if you ignored a thing long enough, it would settle itself. Well, maybe sometimes yes, sometimes no. And look, we find Eleanor Roosevelt later in her life one of the strongest women the nation ever produced. But in the early days of her marriage, still mostly unsure of herself and not a lot of help from her husband. After all, he's looking ahead, career-wise. He wanted to follow Theodore Roosevelt's path, perhaps all the way to the presidency. But that is the story for another day. That is Franklin Roosevelt and Youth, School, and Marriage from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.